Imagine stepping onto hot sand, the roar of 50,000 bloodthirsty spectators shaking your bones. The man across from you is not your enemy, he's just another slave, like you. But one of you will leave in pieces. The crowd doesn't cheer for heroes. They cheer for carnage. This is the reality of a Roman gladiator, not the Hollywood fantasy of honor and glory, but a nightmare of flesh, iron, and desperation. You've heard the legends, the fearless warriors, the epic duels, the thumbs up or thumbs down drama. But the truth? Most gladiators didn't live past their 20s. They weren't volunteers seeking fame. They were prisoners of war, criminals, or slaves, forced into a brutal industry where death was the main attraction. The average fight wasn't a long, dramatic clash of skill. It was short, messy, and horrifying. A single mistake meant a sword through the gut, sand turning to mud beneath you. Take the Munis, the gladiatorial games. They weren't just sport. They were political propaganda, a way for emperors and wealthy elites to buy public favor. The Colosseum? A slaughterhouse disguised as entertainment. The floor was designed to drain blood efficiently. Traps and elevators delivered wild animals into the arena, lions, bears, even giraffes, all to tear apart condemned men for spectacle. And the gladiators? They were investments. A good fighter could be worth more than a farm, so owners fed them well, barley, beans, ashes mixed into drinks to strengthen bones. But make no mistake, they were still disposable. The training was torture. The ludus, the gladiator school, was part prison, part boot camp. New recruits were broken down, whipped into shape by the lanista, the owner who cared more about profit than lives. You'd spar with wooden swords, heavy as real ones, until your arms burned. The best fighters got better armor, better odds. The rest? Thrown to the beasts or forced into damnatio ad bestias, execution by animal. And the worst part? The crowd's laughter as you screamed. But here's what they don't tell you, not all gladiators fought to the death. Killing a trained fighter was expensive. Many matches were rigged, the outcome decided beforehand. The editor, the sponsor of the games, wanted a show, not a massacre, unless the crowd demanded it. And they often did. If a gladiator fought poorly, the chance of Ugula, kill him, would rise like a wave. The victor would look to the editor, who'd play to the mob. A thumb turned sideways might mean mercy. Down. Death. But even mercy was a lie. A wounded gladiator was often dragged to a dark room beneath the arena, where a man with a hammer waited. And what about the women? Yes, female gladiators existed. The Romans called them gladiatrices. They were rare, shocking, and exploited twice over, forced to fight while the crowd jeered at the unnatural spectacle. Some were noble women fallen from grace, others were slaves with no choice. Their battles were even more vicious, because the crowd saw them as a perverse novelty. So why did some gladiators survive years in this hell? Luck. Skill. And sheer terror. The ones who lived long enough could earn the rudis, the wooden sword symbolizing freedom. But few walked away. Most died forgotten, their names erased, their bodies dumped in mass graves. The next time you hear about the glory of the arena, remember the truth, it was never about heroism. It was about power, cruelty, and the price of a man's life when the world sees him as entertainment. Still think you could have survived as a gladiator? Think again. And if this glimpse into Rome's darkest spectacle shocked you, just wait, there's so much more to uncover. Stay tuned. And don't forget to subscribe, because history's darkest secrets are waiting to be revealed. You might think gladiators were all muscle-bound brutes, swinging swords blindly. But the deadliest fighters were often the most disciplined, trained in precise, calculated brutality. The retiarius, for example, fought with a net and trident, light and fast, dancing around his opponents. The secutor, clad in heavy armor, was a human tank, relentless and crushing. Each type was engineered for maximum spectacle, pitted against others in a deadly game of rock-paper-scissors. And every move was choreographed, not for fairness, but for drama. The morning of the games was a horror show. Gladiators were paraded into the arena like livestock, forced to salute the emperor with the infamous words, Ave, Imperator, morituri te salutant, Hail, Emperor, those who are about to die salute you. Some emperors, like Claudius, reportedly enjoyed watching their faces as they spoke, savoring their fear. Then came the venatio, the wild beast hunts. Men with spears or no weapons at all were thrown against starving lions, bears, and bulls. The sand would already be slick with blood before the first gladiator even stepped forward. And the fights? Far from the noble duels of legend. Many gladiators were noxii, condemned criminals, given dull or poorly balanced weapons to ensure a quick, humiliating death. Others were forced into andabati, fighting blindfolded in helmets with no eye holes, swinging wildly until one collapsed. The crowd roared with laughter as they stumbled, hacking at air. This wasn't combat. It was sadistic theater. But here's the twist, some gladiators did become superstars. The Romans kept detailed records of fighters, their wins, their styles, their odds. The best were like modern athletes, with fan followings and graffiti praising their names. A few even earned enough to buy freedom or retire. But for every champion, there were 100 corpses. And even fame couldn't protect them. The Emperor Commodus, obsessed with gladiatorial glory, would step into the arena himself, but his fights were rigged. Opponents were given wooden swords. They couldn't fight back. And when he won, the crowd had no choice but to cheer. The psychological toll was unimaginable. Gladiators lived knowing each day could be their last. Some embraced fatalism, carving memento mori, remember you must die, into their gear. Others turned to superstition, praying to Nemesis, goddess of vengeance, before fights. And then there were those who simply broke. There are records of gladiators throwing down their weapons, begging for mercy, only to be butchered where they stood. And what happened after the fight? If you died, your body was dragged through the Porta Libidinensis, the gate of death, where attendants stripped your armor and looted your corpse. If you survived, you returned to the ludus, patched up just enough to fight again. There was no retirement plan. No happy ending. Just blood, sand, and the distant roar of the crowd, already hungry for the next kill. But the darkest secret of all? The games weren't just about violence. They were about control. Rome was an empire built on conquest, and the arena was a warning, this is what happens to those who resist. Enemies of the state weren't just executed, they were performed. Rebels, prisoners, even Christians were dressed as mythical monsters and torn apart by beasts. The message was clear, defy Rome, and your death will be a spectacle. So the next time you picture a gladiator, don't imagine a heroic warrior. Imagine a man with no choice, stepping into the light, squinting at the crowd, knowing they'll cheer whether he lives or dies. His fate wasn't in his hands. It was in the hands of an emperor who saw him as expendable. And that's the brutal truth. But the story isn't over yet. Because what happened outside the arena was just as horrifying. Want to know how Rome's darkest industry really worked? Stay tuned. And if you're not subscribed yet, do it now. Because history's most shocking secrets are still waiting. Behind every gladiator's fight was an empire-wide machine of suffering, one that reached far beyond the arena. The gladiatorial games weren't just entertainment, they were an industry, powered by slavery, corruption, and calculated cruelty. And the men who ran it? They were worse than the fighters themselves. Take the lanista, the owner of a gladiator troupe. Part trainer, part slaver, all businessmen. His fighters were property, nothing more. A healthy gladiator was a valuable asset, but a dead one could still turn profit, especially if he died spectacularly. Some lanisti were known to bribe officials to ensure their fighters got easier opponents early on, building their reputations before throwing them into impossible battles later. Others deliberately mismatched fighters to create the most gruesome outcomes possible, because bloodshed meant bigger crowds, and bigger crowds meant more money. Then there were the doctors, or what passed for them. Roman medicine was primitive, but gladiators received better care than most slaves. Not out of mercy, but necessity. A wounded fighter could be worth more alive than dead. The physician Galen, who worked in a gladiator school, wrote about stitching up gashes, setting broken bones, and even attempting early forms of surgery. But the treatments were agonizing. Infections ran rampant. And if a fighter was too badly injured, a quick hammer blow to the head was cheaper than a long recovery. But the real horror wasn't just in the fights, it was in the waiting. Gladiators spent most of their lives in the ludus, the training prison. The cells were cramped, the food was bland, and the punishments were brutal. Disobedience meant flogging, branding, or being thrown into the ergastulum, a pitch-black isolation pit where men lost track of time, screaming into the void. Some broke and became obedient. Others went mad. And a rare few planned escapes. There were rebellions. The most famous was Spartacus, a gladiator who turned an uprising into a full-scale war. But what they don't tell you is how rare that was. Most gladiators never even tried to run. Why? Because the punishment wasn't just death, it was example-making. Fugitives were crucified along roads, their rotting bodies left as warnings. And if they were recaptured alive, they were sent to the arena naked, unarmed, and pitted against multiple opponents. The crowd loved those fights. And what about the emperors? They didn't just watch, they participated. Caligula once ordered an entire section of the crowd into the arena to be mauled by lions because he was bored. Domitian hosted nighttime fights by torchlight, where the flickering shadows made the bloodshed even more surreal. And Nero, infamously, forced hundreds of Christians into the arena dressed as mythical creatures, setting them on fire to illuminate his garden parties. But here's the most disturbing part, the people loved it. The games weren't forced on an unwilling public, they were demanded. Tickets were free because the emperor's new bread and circuses kept the masses docile. The poor, the unemployed, the disenfranchised, they all packed the stands, screaming for death. It wasn't just entertainment. It was catharsis. A way to feel powerful in a world where they had none. So the next time you hear about the glory of Rome, remember this, its greatest spectacles were built on endless suffering. The gladiators weren't heroes. They were victims of a system designed to break them. And the crowd? They were complicit. But the story isn't over yet. Because the games didn't die with the empire, they evolved. Want to know how the legacy of the arena still haunts us today? Stay tuned. And if you're not subscribed yet, do it now, because history's darkest lessons are the ones we need to remember. You might assume gladiators were faceless killers, stripped of all humanity. But some left behind haunting traces of their lives, graffiti scribbled on walls, personal trinkets buried in barracks, even love letters. These weren't mindless brutes. They were men with families, regrets, and shattered dreams. And that makes their fate even more horrifying. Take the graffiti found in Pompey's gladiator barracks. One fighter carved, Celadus the Thracian, 3-time victor, the sigh of the girls. Another wrote simply, "Weep, you who have never been wounded." These weren't boasts, they were desperate grasps at identity in a world that saw them as disposable. Even the famous mosaic from Slyton shows a gladiator stepping over his opponent's body, but instead of delivering the killing blow, he's looking away. Was it mercy? Shame? We'll never know. Then there were the children. Some gladiators had families visiting them, wives smuggling in extra food, sons staring wide-eyed at their father's scars. But the schools strictly controlled these visits. Emotional attachments made fighters hesitant to kill. And hesitation meant bad entertainment. There are records of Lanisti banning families entirely, or worse, forcing gladiators to fight their own relatives for the crowd's amusement. The psychological warfare extended to the arena itself. Before major games, organizers would parade exotic animals through Rome, giraffes, rhinos, even polar bears, to build hype. Prisoners of war were dressed as enemy soldiers and forced to reenact recent battles, only to be slaughtered mid-performance. The message was clear: this is Rome's power. You could be next. But the ultimate mind game? The missio, the rare chance for a defeated gladiator to beg for mercy. The crowd would vote, but the decision was always rigged. If a fighter had pleased them, they might spare him. If he'd been boring, death. And sometimes, even mercy was torture. There are accounts of fighters being pardoned only to have their hands severed, ensuring they'd never hold a sword again, just a living reminder of the arena's generosity. As Christianity rose, the games faced backlash, but not for the reasons you'd expect. Early church fathers like Augustine didn't object to the killing, they lamented that spectators enjoyed it too much. The real death knell came when Rome's economy crumbled. Maintaining gladiators became too expensive. The last known games were in 404 AD, not because of morality, but bankruptcy. Yet the legacy lived on. Medieval knights adopted gladiator-style tournaments. Victorian strongmen performed in circuses. Even today's MMA fighters echo the same spectacle: two combatants, one cage, a crowd screaming for blood. The packaging changed, but humanity's thirst for violence didn't. So the next time you watch a combat sport, ask yourself, are we really so different from those Roman crowds? The gladiators are gone, but the arena never left. It just found new forms. One final chapter remains, the untold story of how gladiators shaped history's darkest entertainments. Want to hear it? Stay tuned. And hit subscribe, because some truths shouldn't stay buried in the sand. The sand has settled. The crowds have dispersed. But the ghost of the arena still whispers to us across 2,000 years. Because the most shocking truth about gladiators isn't how they died, it's how their legacy still walks among us today. Consider this: modern stadiums are architectural twins of the Colosseum. The same sweeping curves. The same tiered seating separating the rich from the poor. The same thunderous roar when violence erupts. Football hooligans, boxing fans screaming for knockouts, even viral fight videos. We've never stopped being that bloodthirsty Roman crowd. We just pretend our violence is more civilized. Archaeologists digging beneath gladiator schools found tiny bones, remnants of children raised to replace fallen fighters. Today, human traffickers still groom child soldiers in war zones. The Lanisti of old would recognize the business model immediately: break them young, train them hard, profit from their suffering. Even gladiator marketing tactics survive. Roman merchants sold souvenir clay lamps with fighters' names, betting slips stained with wine, even fast food from arena vendors. Now we buy athlete jerseys, fantasy league stats, and overpriced stadium hot dogs. The packaging changed. The exploitation didn't. But here's what truly chills the blood: gladiators knew they were trapped in the system, just as many modern people feel trapped in theirs. The Roman poet Martial wrote of a fighter who plunged his sword into his own throat rather than kill another slave. Today, how many wage slaves dream of similar escapes? The arena never disappeared. It just put on a suit. As the ruins of the Colosseum crumble, they ask us an uncomfortable question: are we the civilized ones, or just Romans with better technology? We've replaced swords with keyboards, blood sport with reality TV, but the human craving for watching others suffer remains unchanged. That's the gladiator's final lesson. Not about ancient Rome, but about us. About what we're still willing to sacrifice for entertainment. About who we still throw to the lions. The games never ended. You've been sitting in the stands all along. If this journey through history's darkest arena made you see the modern world differently, do what those long-dead gladiators never could: break the cycle. Share this truth. And subscribe, because some mirrors are too dangerous to look into alone.